The morning of February 17th, 1944 broke clear and cold over Rabaul Harbor at 8:43 a.m. when Lieutenant Robert Hanson pushed his F4U Corsair's throttle to full military power and began his climb through 12,000 feet. At 23 years old, he was already credited with 20 confirmed kills, but the formation rising to meet him that morning represented something different. 48 Mitsubishi Zeros, launched from 4 separate airfields, climbing in perfect tactical formation toward the single American fighter that had just violated the most heavily defended airspace in the Southwest Pacific. His squadron mates from Marine Fighting Squadron 215 had already turned back, their fuel gauges showing critical levels after the long transit from Bougainville. Standard doctrine called for immediate withdrawal when outnumbered more than 3-1. The Japanese pilots, climbing toward interception, had collectively accumulated over 15,000 combat hours. They flew the legendary Zero fighter that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor, and they were defending their primary naval base with every tactical advantage doctrine could provide. Hanson's Corsair carried 1,200 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition across 6 Browning machine guns, enough for perhaps 90 seconds of continuous firing if he maintained perfect fire discipline. The mathematics were brutally simple. 48 enemy fighters against 1 American aircraft meant each burst had to count, each maneuver had to be perfect, and any mistake would end with his Corsair tumbling into the Solomon Sea 23,000 feet below. What happened in the next 12 minutes would rewrite everything Japanese Fighter Command believed about American pilot training, aircraft capabilities, and the tactical doctrine that had served them since the war began. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't superior numbers or legendary aircraft. It's a pilot who understands that rules are written by people who've never faced impossible odds alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The radio transmission had crackled through Henderson Field's Operations Center at 06:15 hours on February 17th, cutting through the humid dawn air that made every metal surface slick with condensation. All available fighters to briefing room. Major strike package inbound to Rabaul. This is not a drill. Lieutenant Robert Hanson had been awake for 30 minutes, sitting in the tent he shared with 5 other Marine pilots, cleaning the 50 caliber machine guns he'd personally maintained since arriving in the Solomon Islands 3 months earlier. The voice belonged to Major Robert Owens, commanding officer of VMF 215, and his clip delivery meant the mission would push operational parameters beyond standard safety margins. Hanson pulled on his khaki flight suit, the fabric still damp from yesterday's sortie, and walked across the pierced steel planking that passed for a runway, past the revetments where ground crews were already fueling the line of Corsairs that represented America's answer to Japanese air superiority. The morning smelled of aviation gasoline, hot metal, and the perpetual jungle rot that infected everything on Guadalcanal, despite 2 years of American occupation. He had arrived on the island in November 1943 as part of the squadron's rotation from Espiritu Santo, carrying a flight logbook documenting 647 hours of flight time and 15 confirmed kills earned during his first combat tour. The other pilots called him Butcher, sometimes Bob, never with the casual familiarity reserved for men who'd survived the desperate early days, when Henderson Field changed hands weekly and pilots slept in their cockpits between missions. Hanson's path to this moment had begun in Lucknow, India, where he was born to missionary parents in 1920. His childhood, spent between India and Massachusetts, had instilled in him a quiet determination that his instructors at Hamline University in Minnesota would later describe as remarkable focus under pressure. He'd earned his private pilot's license in 1940 at age 20, paying for flight time by working odd jobs and saving every dollar he could spare. The freedom of flight had captivated him immediately, that sensation of leaving earthly constraints behind and operating in 3 dimensions where physics and skill determined outcomes rather than social circumstances or family connections. When war came to America on December the 7th, 1941, Hanson was in his final year at Hamline. He enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve the following week, driven by a conviction that his flying skills represented the most valuable contribution he could make to the war effort. His training at Naval Air Station Pensacola had been unremarkable in most respects, producing solid marks in navigation, gunnery, and formation flying without distinguishing him as exceptional among the hundreds of young men learning to fly military aircraft. But his instructors had noted something unusual in his performance during simulated combat exercises, where most student pilots became overwhelmed by the complexity of tracking multiple aircraft while managing their own energy state. Hanson seemed to develop greater clarity as situations became more chaotic. Inside the operations tent, Owens stood before a hand-drawn map of New Britain showing Rabaul's 5 airfields, 4 harbors, and the concentric rings of anti-aircraft batteries that made it the most heavily defended target in the Southwest Pacific. Intelligence reports increased Japanese naval activity over the past 72 hours, he said, tapping the map with a wooden pointer. Photo reconnaissance shows at least 60 cargo vessels in Simpson Harbor with destroyer escorts. We're hitting them today with everything we've got. Hanson studied the faces around him. 22 pilots, most of them veterans of the Solomons campaign that had officially ended in February but continued bleeding men and machines in daily skirmishes over Japanese-held territory. Captain Harold Spears sat in the front row, his 19 confirmed kills making him the squadron's second-ranking ace behind Hanson. Next to him, Lieutenant George Axtell cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife, projecting the studied indifference that came with surviving 5 months of combat where life expectancy measured in weeks rather than years. These men had fought through the grinding attrition of Bougainville, where American forces established forward bases within fighter range of Rabaul, enabling the systematic destruction of Japanese air power that Allied strategy required for subsequent operations in the Central Pacific. They had learned through bitter experience that aerial combat in the Pacific differed fundamentally from the European theater. Over Germany, fighter pilots engaged in high-altitude battles where superior numbers and coordinated tactics determined outcomes. In the Pacific, engagements occurred across vast oceanic distances where navigation errors meant death by fuel exhaustion, where parachuting into enemy territory guaranteed capture or execution, and where every mission pushed aircraft and pilots to the absolute limits of endurance. The strike package will consist of 70 SBD Dauntless dive bombers hitting shipping and port facilities. Owens continued. Fighter escort will be provided by 48 F4U Corsairs from 3 squadrons. VMF 215 will fly top cover at Angels 25. Expect heavy fighter opposition. Intelligence estimates 100-plus Japanese aircraft available for interception. Hanson felt his stomach tighten with the familiar pre-mission anxiety that never quite disappeared, regardless of experience or previous success. He had read the intelligence assessments, studied the tactical analyses, memorized every aspect of Rabaul's defensive systems until he could navigate the approach corridors blindfolded. But reading about the Mitsubishi A6M0 was fundamentally different from fighting experienced Japanese pilots who'd been flying combat missions since the invasion of China in 1937. The Zero represented Japan's response to the tactical requirements of Pacific warfare, an aircraft optimized for long-range operations and exceptional maneuverability at the cost of pilot protection and structural strength. Its Nakajima Sake radial engine produced barely 1,000 horsepower, significantly less than American fighters, but the aircraft's light weight of less than 6,000 pounds, fully loaded, gave it a power-to-weight ratio that enabled climbing and turning performance American pilots found nearly impossible to match. Japanese designers had achieved this performance by eliminating armor protection around the cockpit, using unprotected fuel tanks that would ignite when struck by incendiary ammunition, and building the airframe from thin aluminum alloys that sacrificed structural strength for weight savings. The tactical doctrine that evolved around the Zero's capabilities emphasized individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability in turning engagements where the lightest, most agile fighter could gain positional advantage. Japanese pilot training, which had once required 3 years of intensive instruction, including extensive acrobatic flying and gunnery practice, had produced aviators whose skill levels exceeded anything American training programs achieved in 1941 and 42. These pilots had dominated Pacific skies during the opening years of the war, destroying Allied aircraft in ratios that sometimes exceeded 10-to-1 in Japan's favor. The Corsair he would fly that morning, Bureau number 49,843, had been delivered to VMF 215 in January. Relatively new by Squadron standards, where most aircraft showed bullet holes patched with aluminum plates and fabric tape. The Chancevort F4U represented the culmination of American naval fighter development, incorporating lessons learned from 2 years of Pacific combat into an aircraft designed to outperform Japanese opposition in every category except low-speed maneuverability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Pratt & Whitney, a 2,800 double wasp engine, generated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, driving a 13-foot 4-inch Hamilton standard propeller that required the distinctive inverted gull wing design to provide adequate ground clearance. Maximum speed approached 450 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, nearly 70 miles per hour, faster than the Zero's best performance. Service ceiling exceeded 40,000 feet. Rate of climb reached 3,000 feet per minute at sea level, enabling the Corsair to reach combat altitude faster than any Japanese fighter could intercept. The aircraft structure, built to withstand carrier landing impacts of over 600 feet per minute descent rate, could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter Japanese aircraft. Most significantly, the Corsair mounted 6 Browning AN-M2 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. This represented more firepower than any single-engine fighter in the world, enabling American pilots to destroy enemy aircraft with short bursts that Japanese pilots would need sustained fire to achieve. The ammunition load of 400 rounds per gun, totaling 2,400 rounds across all 6 weapons, gave American pilots the ability to engage multiple targets during a single mission, where Japanese fighters often exhausted their ammunition after 1 or 2 engagements. The numbers represented months of engineering refinement, but more importantly, they demonstrated American industrial capacity to develop and mass-produce aircraft that could match or exceed Japanese designs that had ruled Pacific skies unchallenged for two years. By early 1944, American aircraft factories were producing fighters at rates exceeding 700 per month, replacing combat losses and building numerical superiority that would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns. Japanese industry, constrained by limited resources and strategic bombing that was beginning to affect production facilities, could barely replace their losses, creating a death spiral where experienced pilots died faster than replacements could be trained. The briefing continued with weather reports, radio frequencies, and recognition signals, but Hanson found his attention drifting to tactical considerations that would determine survival during the mission. Rabaul's defensive systems had evolved through 18 months of continuous American air attacks into the most sophisticated, integrated air defense network in the Pacific theater. Japanese radar stations, based on technology captured from the British in Singapore, provided early warning of incoming formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles, enabling fighter controllers to vector interceptors into optimal positions before American aircraft reached the target area. Anti-aircraft batteries surrounded every strategic facility with overlapping fields of fire that created death zones extending from sea level to 15,000 feet. The Japanese had positioned hundreds of guns, ranging from 25mm automatic weapons to 127mm heavy anti-aircraft artillery around Simpson Harbor, creating a defensive umbrella that had destroyed dozens of American aircraft during previous raids. Attacking through this curtain of steel required precision timing, coordinated maneuvers, and acceptance of casualties that would have been unthinkable during peacetime training exercises. Fighter escort assignments will depart Henderson Field at 0730 for rendezvous with bomber formations over Treasury Islands, Owens announced. Maintain radio discipline. Report all contacts immediately. We'll have radar coverage until you reach New Britain. Then you're on your own. After the briefing, Hanson walked to his aircraft where Staff Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, his crew chief, supervised the pre-flight inspection with the meticulous attention to detail that separated competent mechanics from those whose pilots didn't return from missions. Kowalski had arrived on Guadalcanal in August 1942 with the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, surviving malaria, dysentery, and more Japanese air raids than official records documented. His hands moved over the Corsair's engine cowling with practiced efficiency, born from understanding that properly torqued bolts and clean fuel lines represented the difference between mission success and another name on the Squadron memorial board. The mechanic's relationship with his assigned pilot went beyond simple professional cooperation. In combat squadrons, crew chiefs took personal responsibility for the aircraft and pilots they maintained, working 18-hour days to keep fighters operational and losing sleep over mechanical issues that might compromise pilot safety. Kowalski had maintained Hanson's aircraft since the pilot arrived at Guadalcanal, learning his preferences for control surface rigging, gun harmonization distances, and the specific quirks that made each Corsair unique despite coming from the same production line. He knew that Hanson preferred his guns harmonized at 300 yards rather than the standard 400, believing that closer engagement ranges maximized hit probability. He knew that the pilot meticulously cleaned his own guns after every mission, unwilling to trust even the most competent armorer with weapons that might mean the difference between survival and death in combat. Oil levels good, Lieutenant, Kowalski reported. Ammunition belted and checked. All 6 guns test fired yesterday. Radio's working, but the number 2 frequency selector sticks sometimes. Work it gentle. He paused, studying Hanson's face with the frank assessment of an experienced non-com who'd watched too many pilots climb into cockpits and never come back. Big one today? Yes, Sergeant. Listen close. Rabaul's not like the milk runs over Bougainville. Japanese up there are first-line units with real combat time. They'll be waiting at altitude with fuel and ammunition to spare. Don't get separated from your division. Don't chase damaged aircraft into anti-aircraft range. And remember, your Corsair's faster and tougher than anything they're flying. Use that. Kowalski's advice carried weight, accumulated through watching friends disappear into the jungle or simply fail to return from routine patrols over waters that had earned the name Iron Bottom Sound from the number of ships and aircraft resting on the seabed below. The waters between Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Florida Island had claimed dozens of naval vessels during the desperate battles of 1942, their wrecks providing underwater reefs where fish now schooled and coral gradually reclaimed steel that had once carried men into battle. More than 100 aircraft rested in those same waters, their pilots' bodies still strapped into cockpits that had become their coffins. At 0720, Hanson strapped himself into the cockpit and began his engine start checklist with the ritualized precision that combat pilots developed as psychological armor against pre-mission stress. The Corsair's controls felt familiar under his hands. Throttle, mixture, propeller pitch, landing gear, flaps, gun sight, radio. He had practiced these procedures hundreds of times, but never before a mission where intelligence predicted Japanese opposition exceeding 100 aircraft defending their most critical naval base. The engine caught on the first attempt, settling into the distinctive deep rumble of a properly tuned radial engine that pilots claimed they could feel through the seat of their pants before hearing through their leather flight helmets. Around him, 21 other Corsairs were coming to life, their Hamilton standard propellers kicking up clouds of coral dust that caught the morning sunlight and created a haze that obscured the far end of Henderson Field's 10,000-foot runway. The takeoff was routine, despite the mission's strategic importance. 22 aircraft lifting off at 30-second intervals, climbing southeast toward the Treasury Islands, where they would rendezvous with dive bomber formations, already assembling for the transit to Rabaul. Hanson flew as division leader, with Second Lieutenant William Case maintaining loose formation off his right wing. The second section, led by Captain Spears, flew step down and behind, providing mutual support while maintaining visual contact with all aircraft in the division. At 15,000 feet, the air temperature dropped to comfortable levels, free of the oppressive humidity that made ground operations miserable even during the dry season. Hanson could see for miles in every direction, the dark blue of the Solomon Sea, the green jungle of Guadalcanal stretching toward volcanic mountains that created their own weather systems, the scattered coral atolls of the Treasury Islands chain where the rendezvous would occur. This represented everything he'd loved about flying since earning his private pilot's license in 1940. The freedom that came with leaving Earth behind, the three-dimensional environment where skill and knowledge mattered more than physical strength or social connections. But today carried different weight. Today the empty sky would fill with enemy aircraft, flown by men who'd been fighting this war since before Pearl Harbor. And everything learned in training would be tested by veterans who measured survival in combat hours rather than calendar months. The radio crackled with routine position reports as the formation climbed through 18,000 feet, individual pilots confirming their positions in the tactical formation that would escort 70 dive bombers across 200 miles of open ocean to the most heavily defended target in the Southwest Pacific. Hanson's tactical radio carried the controlled tension of men who understood that the next 2 hours would determine whether they returned to Henderson Field or joined the hundreds of aircraft already resting on the bottom of the Solomon Sea. At 08:15 hours, the rendezvous occurred over Treasury Islands as planned, with 70 SPD Dauntless dive bombers joining up with their fighter escort in a formation that stretched across 5 miles of airspace. The bombers, Douglas aircraft designed for carrier operations, but now flying from land bases throughout the Solomons, carried 1,000-pound bombs intended for Japanese shipping concentrated in Simpson Harbor. Each bomber represented months of industrial production, weeks of crew training, and the accumulated tactical knowledge of 2 years of Pacific combat operations. The SPD Dauntless, despite being declared obsolescent by Navy planners who wanted faster, more modern aircraft, had proven itself the most effective dive bomber in the Pacific. Its ability to place bombs with precision that horizontal bombers could never match had sunk more Japanese tonnage than any other American aircraft. The crews who flew these missions understood their aircraft's limitations. Maximum speed barely exceeded 250 miles per hour, making them vulnerable to fighter attacks. Defensive armament consisted of 2 forward-firing 50-caliber guns and a single flexible 30-caliber machine gun operated by the radio operator, inadequate protection against determined fighter attacks. Their survival depended entirely on the escort fighters that would protect them during the most vulnerable phases of their attack runs. The combined formation turned northwest toward New Britain, climbing steadily to reach attack altitude before crossing the coast, where Japanese radar would detect their approach and vector interceptors into position. Hanson advanced his throttle to maintain position as the formation climbed through 20,000 feet, his Pratt & Whitney engine consuming fuel at rates that made range calculations critical for survival. The Corsair carried 237 gallons of internal fuel, plus provisions for external drop tanks that could extend range beyond combat radius limitations, but every minute of high-power operation reduced the safety margin between mission completion and forced water landing in enemy-controlled territory. At 25,000 feet, the formation leveled off for the final approach to Rabaul. Below them, the Solomon Sea spread out like hammered steel under the tropical sun, its surface broken by whitecaps that marked the prevailing trade winds flowing northwest across thousands of miles of open Pacific. Ahead, the irregular coastline of New Britain emerged from morning haze, its volcanic peaks and jungle-covered ridges marking the eastern approaches to Simpson Harbor, where Japanese naval forces had concentrated since losing Guadalcanal 9 months earlier. The first radar warning came at 08:37 hours as the formation crossed the coast 30 miles south of Rabaul, all ironbound flights. This is Op Center. We're tracking multiple bogies launching from Rabaul airfields. Estimate 40 plus bandits climbing to intercept, Vector 320 for threat avoidance. The transmission carried the mechanical precision of radar operators who'd been tracking Japanese aircraft movements since the establishment of forward warning stations on Bougainville, but the numbers represented the largest concentration of enemy fighters assembled for a single engagement since Operation Igo the previous April. Hanson scanned the sky ahead, searching for the first visual indication of Japanese fighters that radar had detected climbing from Rabaul's 5 airfields. At 25,000 feet, visibility extended beyond 100 miles in the crystalline air that characterized Pacific high-pressure systems, revealing details that would be invisible in the hazy conditions common at lower altitudes. He could distinguish individual coral atolls scattered across the Bismarck Sea, their white beaches contrasting sharply with the cobalt blue of deep water surrounding them. The tactical situation developed with the inexorable logic of opposing forces, converging toward mutual destruction. Japanese fighter controllers, directing their interceptors from radar stations around Rabaul, had calculated American approach vectors, estimated time to target, and positioned their aircraft to achieve maximum advantage. 48 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, representing the cream of Japanese naval aviation in the Southwest Pacific, climbed aggressively toward 30,000 feet, where altitude advantage would enable diving attacks against the American formation. These were not the inexperienced replacement pilots that American forces increasingly encountered as Japanese training programs collapsed under the weight of accelerated wartime demands. The pilots climbing toward interception that morning represented surviving veterans from air groups that had fought since the invasion of China, men who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Philippines, the battles over Java and Sumatra. They flew with the confidence that came from hundreds of combat hours and dozens of confirmed victories against American, British, and Dutch opponents. At 0841 hours, Lieutenant Case spotted them first. Skipper, Bandits 2 o'clock high. Multiple contacts, Angels 30. They're coming down. Hanson acquired the target immediately, counting aircraft as they emerged from the glare of morning sun. The Japanese pilots had deliberately positioned behind them to mask their approach. The enemy formation consisted of 4 separate groups, totaling 48 fighters, flying in tactical formations that demonstrated professional competence earned through months of combat operations against increasingly effective American air power. The lead Japanese formation, composed of 12 Zeros from the veteran 204th Kokutai, initiated their attack dive from 32,000 feet, building speed rapidly as gravity supplemented engine power. Their attack angle, calculated to maximize closure rate while minimizing exposure to defensive fire, would bring them through the American escort fighters toward the vulnerable dive bombers below. Standard American doctrine called for fighter escorts to maintain position, protecting the bombers, engaging enemy aircraft only when they threatened the primary mission. But Hanson recognized immediately that conventional tactics would result in catastrophic losses among the dive bombers, whose defensive armament consisted of single 50 caliber machine guns operated by radio operators with limited fields of fire. The Japanese formation possessed sufficient numbers to overwhelm the bomber escorts through sheer volume of attacks, and their tactical positioning demonstrated professional planning that anticipated American defensive responses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Ironbound 2-1. This is Ironbound Leader, Hanson transmitted, his voice carrying the controlled urgency that characterized critical tactical decisions. I'm engaging the high group. Maintain bomber escort. Without waiting for acknowledgement, he broke formation and rolled his Corsair into a near-vertical climb that consumed airspeed rapidly, but positioned him to intercept the diving Japanese formation before they could establish firing positions against the bombers below. The tactical mathematics were brutally simple. His single aircraft against 12 enemy fighters represented odds that no training manual addressed, but allowing the Japanese formation to attack unmolested, guaranteed mission failure and probable loss of multiple bombers with their crews. The decision to engage alone violated every principle of fighter tactics that emphasized mutual support and numerical superiority. But Hanson understood that tactical doctrine existed to guide normal situations, not to constrain decisions during extraordinary circumstances where conventional wisdom guaranteed failure. The Corsair's superior climb rate, product of 2,000 horsepower driving a massive propeller through thin air at altitude, enabled him to reach interception altitude despite the Japanese formation's initial advantage. At 28,000 feet, with his airspeed bleeding down towards stall speed as the climb consumed kinetic energy, Hanson acquired his first target. His aircraft hung on the edge of aerodynamic stall, that critical point where insufficient airflow over the wings would cause the aircraft to drop out of controlled flight and tumble earthward. The margin between maximum performance and catastrophic loss of control measured in mere knots of airspeed. The lead Zero, flown by a naval aviation flight petty officer with 18 months of combat experience, maintained steady course as his formation prepared to roll into their attack dive. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized formation discipline during the approach phase, with individual aircraft maintaining precise positions that would enable coordinated attacks once combat commenced. The rigidity that made their formations aesthetically beautiful also created vulnerability to aggressive attacks that disrupted tactical cohesion before coordinated maneuvers could begin. Hanson opened fire at 600 yards, an extreme range that most pilots would consider wasteful of ammunition. But his intent was disruption rather than immediate destruction. The tracers, every fifth round in his ammunition belt, drew bright lines through the thin air that converged on the lead Zero's flight path. The Japanese pilot, recognizing the threat, broke formation and rolled into a defensive turn that compromised the entire formation's attack geometry. The tactical effect cascaded through the Japanese formation as individual pilots reacted to the unexpected attack from an angle their briefing hadn't anticipated. Aircraft that had maintained perfect three-plane V formations scattered across 2 miles of airspace as pilots prioritized individual survival over formation discipline. The coordinated attack the Japanese tactics required for maximum effectiveness fragmented into individual engagements, where American advantages in aircraft performance and firepower became decisive factors. Hanson's Corsair, its momentum from the climb exhausted, hung motionless for a fraction of a second before gravity reasserted control and the aircraft began falling earthward. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a vertical dive that built airspeed with terrifying rapidity. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour, then 350, then 400, as the Corsair accelerated through air that offered decreasing resistance at higher speeds. The aircraft's structure groaned under the stress of acceleration forces that pushed the airframe toward design limitations, but Chancefort engineers had built substantial safety margins into their calculations. At 420 miles per hour, he pulled out of the dive and immediately acquired a second target, a Zero, attempting to reform with his scattered division. The Japanese pilot, focused on rejoining his formation, failed to detect Hanson's approach until 50 caliber tracers began walking across his aircraft's port wing. The Zero's wing structure, designed for maximum maneuverability rather than structural strength, collapsed under the impact of armor-piercing incendiary rounds that severed the main spar. The aircraft tumbled earthward, its pilot trapped in a cockpit that no longer responded to control inputs. The engagement expanded rapidly as additional Japanese formations joined the battle, creating a three-dimensional combat area that stretched across 20 miles of airspace above the Bismarck Sea. Radio frequencies became saturated with position reports, tactical calls, and emergency transmissions as nearly 120 aircraft maneuvered for advantage in the clear morning sky. Contrails marked high-altitude maneuvers, while smoke trails indicated damaged aircraft, creating a visible record of tactical development that could be observed from ships 40 miles away. Hanson's ammunition counter showed 1,100 rounds remaining after his first 2 engagements, enough for perhaps 60 seconds of firing if he maintained the fire discipline that separated combat veterans from replacement pilots who emptied their guns in the first 30 seconds of engagement. Each subsequent attack required precise calculation of closure rates, deflection angles, and ammunition expenditure balanced against the number of remaining targets and fuel state that determined how long he could sustain combat operations. His third kill came against a Zero that had separated from its formation while pursuing an American dive bomber. The Japanese pilot, intent on his target, failed to maintain situational awareness of threats developing behind him. Hanson's approach from the bomber's rear quarter gave him a near-perfect deflection shot at 300 yards range. His 2-second burst consumed approximately 160 rounds, but achieved devastating effect as 50 caliber bullets struck the Zero's engine compartment and cockpit area simultaneously. The Nakajima Sakae radial engine, air-cooled and lacking armor protection, disintegrated under the impact of armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate armored targets. The Zero rolled inverted and began a death spiral that would carry it 25,000 feet to the Bismarck Sea below. The pilot, a naval aviation petty officer named Hiroshi Tanaka, who had survived combat operations since the invasion of the Philippines, rode his aircraft down without attempting to bail out, either killed by the initial burst or choosing to remain with his destroyed fighter. The tactical situation continued evolving as Hanson's aggressive attacks disrupted additional Japanese formations attempting to engage the American dive bombers. His 4th and 5th kills came within 40 seconds of each other as he intercepted a 3-plane element of Zeros positioning for an attack run. The engagements followed an identical pattern: high-speed approach from an unexpected angle, short burst of precisely aimed fire, immediate disengagement before remaining Japanese aircraft could coordinate defensive response. Each kill represented not just marksmanship, but tactical awareness that enabled Hanson to identify vulnerable targets, calculate intercept angles, and position his aircraft for shots that maximized hit probability while minimizing his exposure to return fire. This ability to process multiple variables simultaneously while under extreme stress separated exceptional combat pilots from competent aviators who could execute planned maneuvers but struggled when situations deviated from training scenarios. By 08:53 hours, 12 minutes after initial contact, Hanson's Corsair had destroyed 17 Japanese aircraft through a combination of superior tactics, aggressive maneuvering, and the technical advantages that American aircraft design provided. His ammunition counter showed 200 rounds remaining, barely enough for 2 more engagements if he maintained perfect fire discipline. More critically, his fuel gauge indicated consumption rates that gave him perhaps 20 minutes of combat power remaining before he would need to begin the long flight back to Henderson Field. The Japanese formations, shattered by his individual attacks and under pressure from other American escort fighters that had engaged during the running battle, began withdrawing toward Rabaul's airfields. Their tactical plan, carefully developed to maximize advantages against the expected American formation, had been systematically destroyed by a single pilot who refused to fight according to doctrine that prioritized defensive positioning over aggressive offensive action. The dive bombers, protected by Hanson's sacrifice of his own tactical safety, pressed their attack against Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. From 25,000 feet, he could see the SBDs rolling into their attack dives, releasing 1,000-pound bombs with precision that spoke to months of training. Secondary explosions erupted across the harbor as bombs found their targets among the 60 cargo vessels that represented Japan's logistics lifeline to forward bases throughout the Southwest Pacific. But Hanson's Corsair was no longer the pristine fighter that had departed Henderson Field 90 minutes earlier. His engine temperature gauge showed readings approaching redline limits as combat maneuvering had pushed the Pratt and Whitney radial beyond normal operating parameters. Oil streaked across his windscreen from a seal that had failed under the stress of repeated high-G maneuvers, reducing forward visibility. Most concerning, his fuel flow indicator showed consumption rates significantly higher than standard cruise settings, suggesting battle damage to fuel lines or tanks that would shorten his already marginal range back to friendly territory. The withdrawal began at 0905 hours as the dive bombers, their ordnance expended, reformed for the return flight to Guadalcanal. Hanson joined up with the bomber formation, his Corsair's battle damage evident in the oil streaks and fabric patches where 20mm cannon shells had punched through control surfaces without compromising flight control authority. Other escort fighters, showing similar evidence of combat, joined the formation as it turned southeast toward the Solomon Islands, leaving behind a harbor filled with burning ships and an airspace littered with the wreckage of Japanese fighters that would never threaten American operations again. The flight back to Henderson Field took 1 hour and 47 minutes, every minute measured against fuel gauges that showed steady decline toward empty tanks. Hanson's Corsair, designed with range, margins that normally provided comfortable safety buffers, had consumed fuel at combat power settings for nearly 2 hours, exhausting reserves that would have enabled diversion to alternate airfields if mechanical problems prevented landing at the primary destination. At 1,000 feet over Iron Bottom Sound, with Henderson Field visible on the horizon, his engine began running rough as fuel starvation affected the carburetor's ability to maintain proper mixture ratios. The Pratt & Whitney, designed to tolerate significant abuse, continued delivering power despite fuel flow irregularities that would have destroyed engines built to less demanding specifications. But the margin between continued operation and complete failure had narrowed to minutes rather than hours. Henderson Field's tower cleared him for immediate landing, recognizing from his radio transmissions that fuel state had become critical. The approach was routine, despite his aircraft's battle damage and fuel situation. Gear down, flaps extended, power reduced to approach settings that minimized fuel consumption during the final critical minutes before touchdown. The Corsair's main gear contacted Henderson Field's pierced steel planking at 10:52 hours, exactly 3 hours and 22 minutes after takeoff. His engine quit 30 seconds after touchdown as the final drops of aviation gasoline were consumed from tanks designed to hold 237 gallons. The aircraft rolled to a stop under its own momentum, its propeller windmilling silently as ground crews surrounded it with fire extinguishers and emergency equipment. Hanson sat in the cockpit for a full minute, his hands still gripping the control stick, with the death grip that combat pilots developed during extended high-stress operations. Staff Sergeant Kowalski appeared at his cockpit, concern evident on his weathered face as he assessed the battle damage that scarred the Corsair's airframe. "You okay, Lieutenant?" Hanson nodded, unable to trust his voice immediately after the adrenaline and tension of 3 hours of combat operations. "Fine, Sergeant. Aircraft's got some holes, but she brought me home." Kowalski's experienced eyes catalogued the damage with professional efficiency. 20 millimeter through the port elevator. Looks like 7.7 millimeter hits across the wing route, oil coolers leaking. And you landed on fumes. He paused, studying Hanson's face with the frank assessment of a man who'd seen too many pilots pushed beyond normal human limits. "Intelligence is gonna want a debrief." "How many?" 17 confirmed. "Maybe more, but I lost count after the 12th. The number hung in the humid air between them, exceeding any single mission performance in Marine Corps history and establishing a record that would influence American fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. The preliminary debriefing began even before Hanson climbed from his cockpit as Major Owens arrived with intelligence officers who recognized the strategic value of first-hand observations about Japanese tactics, aircraft performance, and the effectiveness of aggressive individual attacks against coordinated enemy formations. The pilot's account was remarkably detailed despite his exhaustion, describing formation vulnerabilities, optimal attack angles, and the specific effects of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition against zero airframe structures. His estimate of 17 confirmed kills seemed conservative given the number of aircraft he'd observed exploding or tumbling earthward, but intelligence protocols required corroborating evidence before officially crediting aerial victories. Gun camera footage, when developed and analyzed, would provide visual confirmation of each engagement, but the immediate tactical assessment focused on replicating the methods that had enabled a single pilot to achieve results exceeding statistical predictions by orders of magnitude. At the 42nd General Hospital, a collection of Quonset huts and field tents that served as the primary medical facility for Allied forces in the Central Solomons, Navy doctors conducted examinations that revealed the physical cost of extended combat operations. Hanson's hands trembled with fine motor tremors that characterized adrenaline exhaustion. His blood pressure readings showed elevation consistent with acute stress response, and his neck muscles had cramped from the constant head movements required to maintain situational awareness during 3 hours of flight operations. Dr. Captain James Morrison, the hospital's chief surgeon who had treated hundreds of combat aviators, understood that the physical symptoms represented normal physiological responses to extraordinary stress rather than pathological conditions requiring treatment. 24 hours of rest, adequate hydration, and prohibition from flight duties would resolve the immediate symptoms, but the psychological impact of single-handedly engaging 48 enemy aircraft would require longer-term monitoring for signs of combat stress reaction that could compromise future performance. The news of Hanson's achievement spread rapidly through Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, carried by informal communication networks that connected combat units across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. Radio operators passed the story along with routine message traffic, transport pilots carried it between bases, and hospital corpsmen shared it with wounded men who needed proof that individual courage could still influence modern warfare's outcome, despite the industrial scale of Pacific combat operations. The psychological impact proved immediate and measurable. Morale reports from throughout the theater showed marked improvement as news of the victory reached combat units that had been fighting defensive battles since Pearl Harbor. Fighter squadrons preparing for upcoming operations against Japanese-held islands received the account as validation that American aircraft, tactics, and pilot training had evolved to match or exceed Japanese capabilities that had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years. On February 18th, 24 hours after the mission, Hanson was cleared for limited duty and reported to VMF 215's operations tent for his formal intelligence debriefing. The session lasted 8 hours and produced a 43-page report that would influence American fighter tactics throughout the remainder of the Pacific War and into the jet age. His detailed observations of Japanese formation vulnerabilities led to modifications in standard attack procedures, while his analysis of the Corsair's performance against the Zero provided valuable data for aircraft designers working on next-generation fighters. The most significant revelation from his debriefing concerned the psychological aspects of aerial combat and the effectiveness of aggressive individual tactics against numerically superior but doctrinally rigid enemy formations. Hanson's ability to disrupt coordinated Japanese attacks through unexpected aggressive maneuvers contradicted prevailing theories about the necessity of maintaining defensive formations when outnumbered. His performance suggested that properly trained pilots flying superior aircraft could achieve results far exceeding predictions based purely on numerical ratios and aircraft performance specifications. Colonel Samuel Moore, intelligence officer for the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, forwarded his final assessment to Marine Corps headquarters in Washington with recommendations that Hanson's tactical methods be incorporated into pilot training curricula and that his achievement be recognized through appropriate awards. The recommendation emphasized that Hanson's success resulted from disciplined application of sound tactical principles rather than reckless heroism, a distinction crucial for military planners seeking to develop training programs that could produce similar results among pilots facing comparable combat situations. The formal recognition came on March 3, 1944, when Hanson received orders awarding him the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry during the Rabaul mission. The citation detailed his aggressive attacks against overwhelming odds, the destruction of 17 enemy aircraft, and the direct contribution his actions made to mission success and the preservation of American dive bomber crews who returned safely to base. But the medal ceremony would never occur. On February 3, 1944, just 14 days after his historic mission over Rabaul, Lieutenant Robert Hanson was killed during a strafing attack against Japanese positions on New Ireland. His Corsair, damaged by anti-aircraft fire during a low-altitude attack run, crashed into the jungle, killing him instantly at age 23. The loss devastated VMF 215 and shocked Marine Aviation Command, which had planned to rotate him stateside for instructor duties where his combat experience could train the next generation of fighter pilots. The circumstances of his death carried tragic irony. After surviving the most intense aerial combat of his career, After demonstrating tactical brilliance that would influence fighter doctrine for decades, he died during a routine ground attack mission that exposed him to anti-aircraft fire from positions that could have been neutralized by artillery or bombing. The mission accomplished nothing strategically significant, destroying a few supply trucks and damaging a coastal road that Japanese engineers would repair within days. The Medal of Honor was presented posthumously to his family on August 15, 1944, in a ceremony at Marine Corps Air Station, El Toro, California. His final tally stood at 25 confirmed victories achieved during 73 combat missions, making him one of the most successful Marine fighter pilots in the Pacific theater, despite a combat career that lasted only 4 months. The legacy extended far beyond individual recognition or tactical innovations documented in intelligence reports. Hanson's achievement over Rabaul demonstrated conclusively that American fighter aviation had evolved from the desperate defensive operations of 1942 to offensive dominance that would characterize the final 2 years of Pacific combat. The methods he pioneered, aggressive individual attacks exploiting aircraft performance advantages, disruption of enemy formation discipline, and absolute fire discipline that maximized ammunition effectiveness, became foundational principles in fighter pilot training programs that produced aviators capable of maintaining American air superiority through subsequent conflicts. The strategic implications resonated through Japanese military planning as intelligence assessments documented the systematic destruction of their fighter formations by individual American pilots whose tactical capabilities exceeded anything their doctrine had anticipated. The psychological impact of losing 17 aircraft to a single enemy fighter in 12 minutes created doubt within Japanese air units that tactical modifications alone could not address. If American pilots could achieve such results despite numerical disadvantage, what would happen when American industrial production provided numerical superiority as well? The broader transformation of Pacific air warfare reflected lessons learned from Hanson's mission and similar achievements by other American fighter pilots operating Corsairs, Lightnings, and Hellcats against Japanese opposition throughout the theater. By mid-1944, American fighter squadrons routinely achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 against Japanese aircraft, establishing air superiority that enabled amphibious operations from the Marianas to the Philippines to Iwo Jima. The tactical principles Hanson demonstrated over Rabaul proved adaptable to jet aircraft in subsequent conflicts. Korean War F-86 Sabre pilots achieved favorable exchange rates against MiG-15 fighters flown by experienced Chinese and Soviet aviators using tactics derived directly from Pacific combat experience. The emphasis on energy management, aggressive offensive action, and exploitation of aircraft performance advantages became fundamental concepts that guided American fighter development through Vietnam and into the modern era. Today, Hanson's name appears on the memorial wall at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar alongside other aviators who demonstrated extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance during the Pacific War. His story represents more than individual heroism or statistical achievement. It embodies the transformation of American military aviation from desperate defensive operations to offensive dominance built on superior tactics, training, and industrial capacity. From the clear skies over Rabaul, where 17 Japanese fighters fell in 12 minutes to a single Marine pilot, emerged principles that would define American air power for generations, a testament to courage, tactical innovation, and the relentless pursuit of victory against determined opposition. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.